Way back in 1875, on the 4th of October in Pembroke, New Hampshire, 17-year-old Josie Langmaid, a girl described to be well-liked, pretty and intelligent, was preparing for a morning walk to school from her family farm where she lived with her mother, father and younger brother. Josie would normally walk to school with her younger brother Waldo, but he had already left and gone ahead of her on this particular day. This was because Josie was actually planning to meet up with one of her friends, a Miss Fowler, on the way to school, and they would walk the remainder of the way together. Josie set off for school that morning a little late, between 8:30 and 8:45 am, and she set off alone. Josie's journey to school was a 2.5-mile walk via dirt paths of the woods that stood between her home and Pembroke Academy. Josie had taken this walk to school on many occasions, but unfortunately on this particular day, Josie wouldn't make it to school. Before the day was done, Josie's parents learned that their 17-year-old daughter had not arrived at school that morning. Her younger brother Waldo had arrived home and explained that she left after him and he hadn't seen her at school all day. He simply presumed that she had stayed at home. Word spread fast between the towns of Pembroke and Suncook, and it wasn't long before a search party was formed with at least 100 men. The first and obvious location to search for Josie was the woods, where she would take a 2.5-mile trip to school every single day. After a few inquiries, it was discovered that Josie had last been seen when passing the Hartford house, and she was about half a mile from school. As the sun began to set, the search party lit their torches to light the way through the dark woodland and the thick undergrowth. At around 9 p.m. that night, part of the search party found Josie Langmaid in an isolated area of the woods just off Academy Road. The area she was found was named Gile Swamp, and unfortunately, they did not find her alive and well. The flickering light from the torches illuminated Josie's blood-soaked torn dress that partially covered her naked body, and as they drew nearer, they could see that she had been badly mutilated and decapitated, and her lifeless body had been discarded in the damp moss, and her head was nowhere to be seen. The search party at once alerted Josie's father, and of course they advised that it may be for the best if he didn't lay eyes upon his daughter's body. But this was his little girl, and he was her father, and all fathers feel a responsibility to their children to keep them safe from harm. How could he not run to his little girl? When he arrived at the scene, I can only imagine, as a father myself, the pure devastation the sight of his poor daughter must have had on his heart and soul. The men quickly made a stretcher and lifted the 17-year-old's remains onto it and carried it to a horse and cart that was close by. It was then taken back to the Langmaid family home, where Josie's headless body was placed on her very own bed, and there she stayed overnight. The very next day, under the light of the sun, the search continued, and they were successful in finding Josie's head about a half a mile away from where her body was found. The head had been wrapped up in her very own oilcloth cape that she had been wearing that morning as she left for school, and on a nearby road they found a 3-foot-long broken wooden club that was soaked in blood. Once Josie's body was on the autopsy table, further disturbing details were revealed, details that explained exactly what had happened to the poor girl. And I will warn you right now, this isn't going to be pleasant to listen to. She had been brutally raped and severely beaten with the club around her head. Her throat was cut, but the killer didn't stop there. He kept going until her head came clean away from her body. It was also believed that Josie was alive when her head was being severed. There was also a cut to Josie's face, and there was also an imprint from the killer's boot heel, where the killer had pressed hard and dug in with his boot with such force it had left the print upon the girl's right cheek. It's believed that the killer held her head down with his boot as he cut her head away from her body. She had also suffered broken bones in her hand, and possibly in a strange attempt to cover up the rape he had inflicted on the poor girl, he took his blade and sliced away the girl's private parts. As you can imagine, when the news broke out of the murder of Josie Langmaid, the community was outraged and everybody was out to find the murderer, but this resulted in a lot of wrongful accusations being flung about. This included the arrest of many tramps from around the area of Pembroke and Suncook, and train-hopping vagrants. This also included the arrest of the only black man in the town of Suncook, but it is safe to say that he was only a suspect purely because of the colour of his skin. So even though arrests were being made, none of them really stuck. It was clear to see that none of them had committed murder. This includes a man named William Drew who lived out in the woods with his wife in a shack. But why was he a suspect? Well, apparently he was a little strange and liked to make inappropriate remarks to young women, and on top of this, Josie's schoolteacher and Miss Lake claimed that Josie told her that William Drew had insulted her, so Josie threatened him by telling him that she would tell her father, and apparently William Drew threatened her by saying that he would kill her and cut her up into pieces. So, as you can imagine, it wasn't looking good for William Drew, who was now suspect number 1. And so it wasn't long before a lynch mob was formed to find William Drew, who would be better off in police custody than in the hands of this mob. But word of mouth had gotten around, and William Drew knew that the police were after him, and so he went on the run. Luckily for him, he was found by the police, who arrested him on the spot and was taken into custody, and they kept him safe from the mob in jail. Although it didn't stop the mob from forming outside of the jail building where Drew was being kept. In fact, the officers had to threaten the lynch mob and warn them that if they tried to take Drew, they would be shot dead on the spot. But after all of this commotion, it would seem that Drew actually had an alibi. On the day of the murder, Drew had actually taken his elderly mother to the doctors. Also, Drew only owned one pair of boots that actually belonged to his wife, and the boots did not match the print that was left on Josie's cheek. Also, the statement that had been given by the teacher about William Drew threatening Josie just didn't hold up, and it was believed that she may have fabricated the whole story due to a personal vendetta between the two of them. Things were once again looking hopeless. It would seem that the murderer had simply gotten away with murder, but at some point in the investigation, a detective on the case had finally received a lead that may actually be promising. A gentleman came forward named Charles Fowler. He was the father of Josie's friend, who she had arranged to meet that morning. Charles told the detectives that he had recently hired a Frenchman named Joseph LaPage. Apparently, LaPage had taken an unhealthy shine to his daughter and liked to ask all sorts of questions about the teenager, and it was clear to see that he'd become infatuated by her. And it was Mr. Fowler's son who informed him that the strange employee would often ask about his sister, asking what school she attended and what route she would take to school. The son clearly thought nothing of this at the time and showed LaPage the routes his sister took to school through the woods. And apparently on the morning Josie was murdered, LaPage had been seen heading in the same direction, holding a club longer than 3 foot in length, very similar to the club found with the body. This was definitely a lead the police wanted to follow, but unfortunately the strange Frenchman had skipped town, and so their lead went cold. However, a year earlier, a schoolteacher named Miss Ball had been murdered in a very similar way in St. Albans, Vermont. And of course, newspapers that reported of the murder of Josie Langmaid had of course reached St. Albans. And one of these newspapers had made its way into the hands of the town's selectman. And he could see certain similarities between the murder of the teacher and the murder of Josie Langmaid. He knew that these two crimes may be connected. At once, he recognised the name. Joseph LaPage once lived in his town. At the same time the teacher was murdered, and he had been a serious suspect in the case against the murdered teacher, but it could never be proven. And he also knew Joseph LaPage's current address, which was in the town of Suncook, with his wife and children. He quickly informed the selectman of Suncook, who just so happened to be Mr. Fowler, the same Mr. Fowler whose daughter had planned to meet Josie that day, and the same Mr. Fowler who employed LaPage to work on his farm. The St. Albans selectman gave him all the information he knew, and the police paid a visit to Suncook to the home of Mr. LaPage, and Mr. Fowler also went with them. When LaPage answered the door, Fowler at once identified him as a man who he had employed on his farm. Whilst the police were searching the house, they found blood-stained clothing, blood-stained straight razors, and a blood-stained knife, and also a pair of boots that matched the imprint on the girl's right cheek. And once the general public knew that LaPage was now suspect number 1, lots of people also came forward providing statements that they had seen LaPage on many occasions harassing young girls. Even a mother and daughter told how they were once cornered in a secluded area by LaPage, who was holding a club, and they only escaped because a random gentleman was passing at the time and saved them from what they believed could have been their death. Even more damning was a statement given by the sister of LaPage's wife, who actually came forward claiming that she was raped by LaPage in a cow pasture after he threatened her with a club, and apparently he was wearing a mask that she pulled from his face. What's interesting about this is the mask was found at the crime scene of the murdered teacher. But was this a man who killed Josie? Well, it would seem that it absolutely was, and the evidence that stacked up against him was undeniable. And it also became clear that she wasn't his first victim, As for the murder of the schoolteacher Miss Ball, well, LaPage was actually a strong suspect in that murder case, like I said before, but his sons are giving him an airtight alibi. But with all the evidence now pointing towards LaPage and the murder of Josie, his sons actually recanted their statements, and it would seem that there was a high possibility that he did actually murder the teacher. LaPage was found guilty and sentenced to death. Over the years, he repeatedly denied the murder, claiming he spent the morning roaming the woods lost, but LaPage would eventually own up to the murder when he was on death row, just before his execution, possibly out of fear of what awaited him on the other side. He also owned up to the murder of the young schoolteacher who had been killed in a very familiar fashion. He claimed that she pulled off his makeshift mask revealing his identity, and he had no choice but to kill her. She tried to fight back, but it was all in vain. On the morning of the 4th of October, LaPage had actually set out into the woods to meet and murder Mr. Fowler's daughter, who was waiting for Josie to meet her so they could walk to school together. But as we know, Josie was running late that morning, so the Fowler girl decided to set off without her. Luckily, a neighbour was passing by on horse and cart and offered the young girl a ride to school, and this definitely saved her life. Unfortunately, Josie Langmaid came along the same route not long after, and realising that her friend had probably left for school without her, she carried on with her journey to school. At some point, she was attacked by LaPage in a secluded area where he proceeded to beat her with a club, smashing her hand as she tried to defend herself. He then raped and mutilated her and dragged her body further into the woods and went even further with her decapitated head. LaPage would then give directions leading the police to an area in the woods where he buried certain belongings of Josie's, which were an earring and a black ring, and this now made it 100% clear that LaPage was the killer. Only he would know these details. LaPage, who was now known as the French Monster, was executed on March the 16th, 1878. He was hung by the neck until dead. After the murder, Josie was laid to rest in Pembroke. She actually had an open casket so people could pay their respects. Her head had been reattached by sewing it back into place, and a delicate garland of flowers were made up to cover her neck and hide the stitches. Sadly, a few months later, Josie's loving brother Waldo, who had never gotten over the death of his sister and felt a great deal of guilt, unfortunately succumbed to typhoid followed by pneumonia, and he died on December the 15th, 1875, and he was buried alongside Josie. Sometime later, a monument was erected in the memory of Josie Langmaid, which for some reason has morbid directions chiselled into the stone, directions to where her body was found and her head. And that monument is still there to this very day.